I'm Ling, and in today's video I'm going to show you exactly how to make this designer card wallet. This is the video that I really wish existed when I was getting into leather crafting. There's a ton of really informative videos out there, but I didn't feel like there was one video that really walked me through a project from start to end where I didn't have to look something else up. So I'm hoping that I am able to synthesize all of the knowledge that I've collected into this one video for you. If you're thinking about getting into leather crafting, I really think that this card wallet is the perfect first project because it's such a good way to practice all of those foundational skills, especially stitching. I'm going to walk you through every step of the way. I'll give you some of my tips and tricks, and then I'm going to give you a really in-depth saddle stitching tutorial. I think it's something that is typically overcomplicated. I've watched a lot of videos that, to me, explain it in a very complicated way. So hopefully the way that I explain it makes sense to you. And then I'll also point out some of the mistakes that I made on this card wallet so that you don't make those same mistakes too. I'm hoping that you'll see how fun and easy it is to start and finish a project and get that sense of accomplishment and satisfaction when you're done. I've seen designer brands sell card wallets very similar to this one for $250 to $550, but I'm going to show you how we can make it for just $3 worth of material, including the leather. Okay, before we get into the meat of it, let's talk about what you're going to need. Check out my leather crafting tools video where I explain all the basic tools, how they work, and where to get them. I'm also going to list the specific tools that I use for this project in the description down below. Okay, once you have your tools, you're going to need to get some leather. This is the leather that I used. You can see it's not a very big piece, and I've probably used about 10% of this. So that's another reason why I think this project is really good. You really don't need to spend that much money on leather. I would say the most important thing when it comes to buying leather for this project is getting the right thickness. I would look for something that is in the 3 to 5 ounce range. Because we are going to be stacking up 6 pieces of leather into one card holder, it can get too thick if you have something that is on the higher side. So look for something that is thin and also something that is stiff, because this is going to be something that you use every day. It's going to definitely see some wear and tear. Alright, so now that we have everything that we need, we're ready to get into the tutorial. The very first thing you'll need to do is print out and cut the pattern. I've already made the pattern for you, which I'll link down below. Just make sure your printer settings are set to 100% scale before printing, and also verify the size afterwards. If you can, use cardstock or heavier paper because it'll just make the leather cutting process easier. If you don't have access to a printer, don't worry. This pattern is just 3 boxes. I put the dimensions on the PDF so you can just measure it out yourself. The second step is cutting the leather. Play around with the positioning and orientation of your pieces in a way that optimizes the leather and minimizes the waste. If you weren't able to make a cardstock pattern, just use a clear ruler board to guide your blade and ensure that your cuts are all squared up. Make sure that the blade of your cutter is as perpendicular to the leather as possible. And remember to go slowly. There's really no rush, but there's also no undoing any mistake. Avoid overcutting because this is going to decrease the amount of usable leather that remains. Instead, go slow and use an X-Acto knife for the corners. Once your first 3 pieces are cut out, you can use those to make your second set of duplicates. Now it's time for a fit check. Here you just want to make sure you've cut out all 6 pieces correctly and that they fit together. The biggest pieces, which are labeled C, are going to match up to each other with the suede sides facing in. Then add your B piece followed by the A piece on each side. Now is also a good time to tuck away your pattern and save it for future use. Step 3 is marking out your A piece. This is the smallest piece that's going to feature that decorative diagonal stitching. You can start by setting your wing divider to 1/8 of an inch. You're going to use your wing divider to etch in a mark on all 4 edges of your A piece. This mark is going to be your guideline for the next step. Since this wallet is symmetric, everything you do on one side you'll do to its counterpart. Now that we have the borders defined, we're ready to grab the awl and make the diagonal lines. They're marked on the pattern if you want to reference it, but you can also eyeball the angle for this part. The distance between the lines is 1/2 inch. I found it easiest to match up the line on my ruler board to the line underneath on the leather that I previously marked. Keep working like this until you reach the opposite corner. Step 4 is pricking out the stitching holes. These are the holes that your needles will pass through to create the stitch. So grab your pricking iron and hammer. Make sure your iron is as perpendicular as possible to the leather. Line up your first tooth into the last hole you pricked out to make sure that every prick is evenly spaced. When you're doing your first few punches, Check to make sure that the iron has actually punctured through the leather. It's annoying if you get to stitching and the hole isn't going all the way through. If this does happen, you can still use your awl or needle to puncture through it. You can switch to your 2-tooth iron or awl if you're approaching the end of the line. Now we're ready for step 5, which is stitching, one of my favorite processes. Before we actually get into stitching, we'll have to measure out the length of thread. I use 4 times the length of what I'm stitching, but I always throw in a little bit extra because it's really frustrating to be getting to the end of what you're working on and to not have enough thread. Next, lock the thread onto your needles. This is going to make sure your needles stay attached onto the thread. To do this, stab a hole roughly halfway into the width of your thread with your needle, then feed the remaining tail into the eye of the needle and pull it tight. Do this for both ends of the thread for both needles. Now we're ready for the fun part, my saddle stitching tutorial. Like I said in the intro, there are lots of videos out there that I think overcomplicate this. The functional point of a saddle stitch is to tie a knot every time your needles pass through the leather. Since each hole will have a threaded knot in it, it makes the stitch much more durable and less likely to unravel. I like to put the side I pricked the iron directly into on my right side in the stitching pony. Let's call this side 1. So with side 1 on my right, I start from the hole closest to me and I stitch away. A lot of people do the opposite of this. They take side 1 and put it on their left, and then they start on the farthest hole and stitch towards themselves. I just find this to be unintuitive and not ergonomic, especially if you have a long piece that you have to reach for to get the stitch started, but it does effectively achieve the same thing. Thread your needle into the first hole and pull until you have equal lengths of thread on both sides. The key to getting a good looking stitch is to pass and loop your thread and needles in the same way every time. I take the needle on my right and I feed it all the way in and through. You can pull that thread and needle away from you while you take your left needle and thread it in from the left side in front of the other thread. When the needle is poking through to the right side, take the right side thread and wrap it around the left needle by going under and then over it. Then just pull the needles till the thread is tight. If my explanation is confusing to you, I'll link other tutorials that may help. And even if my explanation does make sense, it's a good idea to watch other explanations to build up your own understanding of the saddle stitch. One thing I like to do is give the right side thread a little tug after the left side needle has been inserted into the hole, just to make sure that that left needle isn't puncturing into the right side thread. Okay, so now that you hopefully have an understanding of how to do the saddle stitch, it's time to test it out for yourself on all of these diagonal stitches. Don't worry about messing up, that's the whole point of this project, is to give you plenty of stitching practice. It'll be cool when you're 4 or 5 projects into your leather crafting hobby journey to reflect on this first project and see all of the places that you messed up and look at how far you've come. To finish your stitch and make sure that it doesn't unravel, tie a knot and then snip off the remaining thread. Then grab a lighter and melt the knot into place. Once you're done doing all of the diagonal decorative stitching on both A pieces, you can take a hammer and hammer those stitches into place. This is just going to flatten it out and make sure your stitches look even better. Now we're going to do the decorative stitch that runs across the top of piece A. Your line for this should have already been marked out, so you can just go ahead and prick out those holes and then stitch it up. For step 6, we're going to get into some skiving. Like I mentioned in the beginning, this wallet consists of 6 pieces. These are going to be pretty thick to stitch through, so we're going to take our skiving knife and thin down 3 of the 4 edges. That's the bottom and the 2 side edges. I sort of messed up by skiving perpendicular to the edge, but you should really skive so that your blade is parallel to the edge. Do this for all 6 pieces. Now we're almost ready to stitch up the whole thing, but before we do that, let's apply some Tokonole onto the top edges of each piece. To do that, take the tiniest amount of Tokonole on your finger and gently dab it onto the top edge. Once you've worked it in a little bit with your finger, grab your wood slicker and run it back and forth along the edge until it becomes nice and shiny. Step 8 is to use our double-sided tape and start putting the whole wallet together. You can see that my pieces came out a little bit wonky, and that's because I was using a pretty dull skiving knife and skiving in the wrong direction, so don't do that. I applied the tape onto B and then stuck A onto B. Then I applied tape onto C, and stuck the A-B combination onto C. Repeat this again for the other side. Then take both halves and stick them together. Now you've reached step 9, where you'll notice that your edges don't quite look that great. But that's okay, because you can take your ruler board and make sure that all of the edges are even by cutting a straight line across it. This is going to trim off the excess leather. For step 10, grab your wing divider that should still be set at 1/8 of an inch and run it along the sides and the bottom. For step 11, we're going to do our final round of pricking. The way I start is to have one tooth overhanging the edge. Work your way along the perimeter of the wallet, and don't be afraid to use your awl or your 2-prong pricking iron when you get to the corners. For step 12, we're going to stitch our way around the entire wallet. Don't forget to measure out your thread using the 4 times rule, and give yourself even more extra allowance this time because again, you will be stitching through 6 pieces of leather. To start this stitch, I've inserted the thread into the first hole and looped it around the edge of the wallet twice to give it extra reinforcement. Once you're done stitching your way around the entire perimeter, you can finish off the same way you started with that double loop, tie a knot, and then melt it into place with your lighter. For step 13, we're going to be opening up all of the pockets. They've probably gotten pretty gunky from all of the double-sided tape, so it's important to be able to open them up so that you can easily slide your cards in and out. If you're like me and you don't have the right tool, I think that's totally okay. You can probably just use a letter opener, a popsicle stick, really whatever you can find. Now we've got one last thing to do, and that is edge burnishing. You can see here that our edges still look pretty raw, so that's where we're gonna grab our Tokonol and do what we did before and make those edges look nice and polished. This is one of my favorite steps because this is the time where you get to just sit on your couch and run your slicker back and forth. It's such a meditative motion, and it's also a really good time to reflect on all the work you've done and really appreciate the final product in your hands. By the time you're done, it's gonna look even nicer. Okay, that's it for the tutorial. I really hope that you found it helpful. If you end up making a card wallet yourself, please let me know how it turned out. Once you get the hang of it, you can even start adding your own flair. So you can play around with having different colors of leather in the same wallet. You can also do a different decorative stitch pattern. You can even change up the shape, which is why I really like this hobby. There's just so much room for creativity, even in something as simple as a card wallet. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.